Hey class, I'm back. We're by the roadside, so we might be see some people here walking their dogs and such. I found a cool spot, and I'm hoping that the ambient noise will not be too much to bear. But yes, so we're getting started with utilitarianism and how it is that we're working with it by way of McKinnon and Fiala, and then likewise how it is that we understand it by way of J.S. Mill, and then likewise positioning J.S. Mill as an empiricist, and likewise as a follower of Bentham, who came up with and originated the idea of utilitarianism. What is utilitarianism? When we look it up in the glossary of a textbook that I have, we see it as utilitarianism, normative theory that we ought to concern ourselves with the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, and that's associated with Bentham and Mill. So there we have the emphasis on normative. So in other words, the normative aspect of utilitarianism is such that it shows us the value is placed on the ethical components, the ought aspect of how it is that we're valuing actions and likewise consequences, okay? And so right away we need to see utilitarianism as a consequentialist theory, and that's always something that's could be somewhat confusing for students. And the reason why is because the value of the ethical value of the consequence is where the value of the ethical theory resides. So in other words, the way in which the consequences are valued give us whether or not the action was right or wrong, okay? So, in other words, the action to begin with is not where the moral value lies. And so part of the reasoning there stems from the distinction between utilitarianism and such things as natural law. And we'll look at natural law later, but with natural law you have intrinsic values, and so intrinsic values are what Bentham thought was nonsense upon stilts. So in other words, when you're thinking as an empiricist, you're usually just looking for what is tangible and what could be understood by way of perception, whereas intrinsic value is not something that you could necessarily find empirically, okay? So that's part of the reason why utilitarianism needs to rest on this consequentialist basis, because you can't start out with the theory that something is intrinsically good. You have to end up with it as being instrumentally valuable, okay? So in other words, the difference between utilitarianism and natural law is such that the objective value is based on the consequences, okay, of the action, not the actions themselves. So what's important for us to consider there is in terms of environmental concerns. So in other words, with environmental concerns, we might start out with our original goal to recycle, but one part that is problematic there is that even though we might be really careful with our recycling, we still don't always know the outcome of the consequence of our action once it leaves our hands. So in other words, the consequence of goodness is not necessarily as tangible as it is in terms of it being something that starts out with intrinsic value. So in other words, a utilitarian is going to base the value on the happiness that it brought for the most amount of people. So did your recycling bring about the happiness for the most amount of people? That's could be something that is hard to give tangible value to, but we could see that the only way in which we could do that or start to do that is by quantifying, okay? So the quantification then needs to be based on the greatest amount of happiness that's brought about for the most amount of people. So in other words, there's that objective corollary that shows us how it is that emotion is working for a utilitarian. So remember that with Hume, it's a little different, that he's the ethical emotivist, and he didn't necessarily have this accounting for the greatest amount of people, right? And so this accounting for the greatest amount of people is a quantification, okay? And so that's an empirical way in which we could measure emotion, the good that we're bringing people. And so what's important there is that that also becomes a way that we could critique utilitarianism by way of quantity. So in other words, when we're thinking about bringing about the most amount of happiness for the most amount of people, we think of that in a numbers understanding, right? That the larger percentage of people that we satisfy, that if we're basing our moral value on that large percentage of people that we satisfy, that's where our moral value resides. Then we have a majority of people that an action brought about to give us the consequence of happiness for those people. The problem with it is that there's a majority and likewise there's a minority. So in other words, the minority there is problematic for a utilitarian because if you're only aiming for the happiness for your majority, then the minority ends up being somewhat problematic because you're not accounting for their happiness. So in other words, if you're aiming to satisfy by way of your actions the most amount of people, and the consequences are such that you don't satisfy the most amount of people, then there's a problem in terms of it being valuable for a utilitarian. Now, if we look at it in the problematic sense and we see, well, for a utilitarian then, maximizing happiness is what we want. Well, if maximizing happiness is what we want for a majority, and with our action we set out to do that, then there's a problem because there's a minority that could possibly be left behind, right? Because if we satisfy the majority, then the minority then is not necessarily where we're placing the value consequentially, okay? So if we think about that, like say from a recycling standpoint, we might think of ourselves as consumers of goods and that we have decisions to make as far as our recycling, and that those decisions are usually thought of as starting out with goodness as the consequence. In other words, you're aiming for the consequence of goodness when you recycle, okay? So you're aiming to bring about the most amount of happiness by recycling because you know a reduction of waste in the environment is going to bring about happiness for the most amount of people in the long run. At least that's your idea. Then what you're suggesting is that the consequences are such that they are bringing about the most amount of happiness for the most amount of people. In other words, your actions are your recycling is bringing about that about. And there is a question as to whether or not that's true, right? In other words, when I recycle, can I actually say and verify that I am bringing about the most amount of happiness for the most amount of people in terms of my in terms of the consequences of the recycling? I think that that's kind of an open question, right? And so that's something to consider because we don't always know the outcome or the consequences of the recycling. We know that people reuse plastics, but we don't actually know where all the plastic is going. And then likewise, we don't know if it's all being recycled. So there's a disconnect there where we know recycling is good, but is it actually good in terms of something that we could identify consequentially? So that's something to consider, right? And so that's a good way of getting us started to think about the value of utilitarianism from an environmental perspective, and then likewise how to get a sense of environmentalism in terms of utilitarianism. So, in other words, a utilitarian is going to value the consequences of an action, but the value does not rest in the actions themselves, it rests in the consequences. In other words, the outcome of the action is, and the consequence of the action is where the moral value resides for the utilitarian, okay? And so I think that's probably a good place to stop, and then we'll talk a little bit more about negative utilitarianism, okay? Thanks.